Now then, let there be freedom and independence.
At the dawn of 1776, as the light of day cast its glow over the divided land, the case for independence seemed promising, on paper at least. The British had largely abandoned the colonies, retreating to the cold wilderness of Canada and the isolated forts in the west. Major colonial hubs, British free. But what's interesting is if you had taken a colonial-style Gallup poll asking, independence, yes or no, the results might have been surprising. In New England, the answer was a resounding yes, with fiery patriotism burning as brightly as their town hall meetings. Across all 13 colonies, though, maybe 30% were pro-independence, and that's being optimistic. Another 20% loyal to the crown, sipping tea and waving their tiny Union Jacks, muttering, "Why upset the order? British rule isn't so bad." The remaining 50%, they just shrugged. They were undecided. A lot of folks on the frontier, for instance, might have had no clue what was even going on. No newspapers, no tweets, no hashtags, just crops to tend and food to harvest. On the frontier, independence wasn't even a conversation. Just the crunch of frost underfoot as families tilled frozen soil. Taxes, duties, these were city folks' problems. For them, the big issue was keeping the cabins standing against harsh winter storms and hunger. But as the months of 1776 wore on, that 30% started to grow. Why? Enter Thomas Paine, a man armed with a sharp pen and an even sharper opinion. At the tail end of 1775, he published Common Sense, a pamphlet that hit the colonies like an Elon Musk Dogecoin tweet. By early 1776, it was selling faster than fresh baked bread at a Sunday morning market. Over 100,000 copies. Paine never minced words. His message? Why stick with Britain? They tax us for wars we didn't start. They give us no voice in government. And their king? A brute. Paine argued that with all the wealth that were bleeding to Britain, the colonies could build their own navy and army. Independence wasn't just a dream. It was common sense. His plain sass electrified the undecided. Suddenly, people began to reconsider. People who were sitting on the fence leaned towards revolution. Common sense wasn't just a pamphlet, it was a spark that lifted the young nation. Add to that the British retreat from Boston, and the new mood swept through the colonies like a wildfire. People dared to believe. Maybe this revolution wasn't doomed. Maybe, just maybe, it could work. Each small colonial victory and every British stumble added weight to the scales. By mid-1776, momentum for independence had turned into a powerful tide. The colonies were no longer just dreaming of revolution, they were preparing to make history. Now, with the bulk of the British Army held up in Canada, a few lonely frontier forts, the question of independence landed squarely on the hands of the elites convening in Philadelphia. Let's face it, it wasn't the farmers, blacksmiths, or even the frontier families making the call. No, this was a debate for the powdered wig crowd. The wealthy, educated men who spent their evenings sipping tea and quoting Locke and Rousseau like they were the latest TikTok trend. One of these high-minded elites was Thomas Jefferson, a lanky Virginian with ink-stained fingers, a head full of Enlightenment ideals, and a knack for turning big ideas into elegant prose. Jefferson wasn't just a tobacco farmer, he was a wordsmith, a man who could take centuries-old debates about rights and liberties and make it sound downright poetic. Naturally, Congress handed him the quill and said, "Tom, you're up." What Jefferson delivered was nothing short of revolutionary, or as we'd put it today, viral worthy. His draft included some lines that have echoed through history. When in the course of human events, we hold these truths to be self-evident, and the showstopper, that all men are created equal. Jefferson's words lit a fire, but they also cast a long shadow, a contradiction that history is still reckoning with. Yet, in that moment, his declaration gave the colonies a voice, a bold, defiant statement to the world. We are ready to stand on our own. By July 2nd, 1776, the Second Continental Congress had voted to declare independence, and John Adams confidently predicted that date would be celebrated for generations. Nice try, John. July 4th stole the spotlight after newspapers spread the news that day. But declaring independence was just the prologue. Keeping it was the real test. Some optimists hoped that the British might just stay in Canada. Spoiler alert, they didn't. General William Howe, regrouping with reinforcements including hired Hessian mercenaries, deciding his next move, New York. Strategically crucial, it could sever rebellious New England from the rest of the colonies. With around 20,000 troops under his command, General William Howe, poring over his maps, pondering the options spread before him like a chessboard's grandmaster. The question was, should he strike Massachusetts, where the Revolution's fiery rhetoric began, the home of the cradle revolutionary ideals and the attempt to quell the rebellion at its source? A compelling option. Or perhaps Philadelphia, the meeting place of the Continental Congress. Disrupting the leadership could destabilize the movement altogether. Another strong possibility. Then there's the South, where British support is more abundant. He could unite local militias, move northward, and methodically bring the colonies back into British control. After much deliberation, Howe decides New York. Why New York? Strategically, it's a statement. With control of New York, the British can now sever New England. It's a logical and symbolic move, with General Howe envisioning a naval blockade to squeeze the revolution out of existence. Washington, fresh from organizing his forces in Boston, marches his ragtag army of 20,000 strong to Long Island, New York, in anticipation to Howe's invasion. However, when the British landed in August of 1776, the Americans were outgunned and outmaneuvered. Unfortunately, while Washington is a strategic genius in the long game, he's not quite the MVP of battlefield tactics yet. When the British land, it's game over for the colonial forces. The British rout the Americans, forcing Washington to retreat and eventually giving up the city entirely for the rest of the war. What followed was a grueling game of cat and mouse. Howe chased Washington across New Jersey, with the Continental Army retreating from one position to another. The number one goal is to keep the army intact. Due to desertion, illnesses, as well as some enlistments set to expire January 1st, 1777, the morale was cratering. The shrinking army was demoralized and decreased to 3,000 men. Yet Washington is able to hold on to the core fighting force, and crucially, his supplies as well. But he knows time is running out. It's do or die, and Washington isn't about to let the dream of independence fizzle out without one more big, bold gamble. December 25th, 1776. George Washington decides
It's time.
it's time to turn the tide. His plan? A surprise attack on the British allied Hessian troops stationed in Trenton, New Jersey. These Hessians, also known as German mercenaries, had been chasing Washington alongside the British redcoats while also indulging in the comforts of colonial life. Many marveled at the colonists' wealth and land ownership, questioning why they were even rebelling in the first place. Now settled in Trenton, the Hessians likely assumed Washington would continue his retreat. But Washington had other ideas. Under the cover of Christmas night, he and his men prepared to cross the icy Delaware River. This moment immortalized by the famous Washington crossing the Delaware painting. The crossing was arduous, with freezing waters, strong winds, and pitch darkness making every step treacherous. By the early hours of December 26th, Washington and his troops make it across and begin their march towards Trenton. Dawn. Sleeping soundly, the Hessians are caught completely off guard. Washington's forces launch their attack, an overwhelming victory. The mercenaries were unprepared. Just under 1,000 Hessians are captured, 22 Hessians perish, and the crucial supplies are seized, while the Continental Army suffers only 2 casualties. While Trenton isn't a major strategic win, it doesn't even halt the British advance, nor prevent the eventual capture of Philadelphia. However, it's a crucial morale booster. This victory proves that the revolution for independence is far from over, inspiring Washington's troops to re-enlist and drawing new recruits to the cause. Trenton becomes a symbol of hope and resilience for the revolution. It may not compare to the grand heroics of ancient battles, but it's enough to keep the independence alive. The victory at Trenton was crucial, but it was just the beginning. The real turning point for revolution would come about 6 months later, in the summer of 1777, during the Saratoga campaign, a moment that would change the course of the war. Okay, here's the situation. Washington was still gathering troops, while British forces held strong in New York and Philadelphia. Meanwhile, from their base in Canada, the British devised a bold new strategy. Let's isolate New England from the rest of the colonies. By cutting off the northern colonies, they hoped to weaken the rebellion's core. Commanding this ambitious plan was General John Burgoyne. Burgoyne brought together a formidable force of about 10,000 men, including disciplined British redcoats, Hessian mercenaries, and some native allies. His mission was straightforward in theory: march south from Canada through New York, join up with British forces moving up from New York, and tighten the grip on the northern colonies. By June 1777, the general's army began its march southward. Washington, anticipating the British maneuver, sent a force to counter it. He replaced General Horatio Gates in charge, with Benedict Arnold, still loyal and highly effective at this point, serving as his energetic and daring second-in-command. The Continental Army started assembling in western New York, preparing for what would be a crucial showdown. However, Burgoyne's path through New York was far from easy. The rugged wilderness posed severe challenges. Dense forest, swampy ground, steep hills, and sluggish rivers all slowed his progress. His army's supply lines stretched dangerously thin, and the local militias took every opportunity to attack, cutting off provisions and harassing his troops at every turn. Adding to Burgoyne's difficulties, the Americans had fortified key points along his routes with defensive works and forts, creating bottlenecks that further delayed the British advance. What had begun as a confident campaign now became an exhausting struggle. The stage was set for a decisive moment. As General Burgoyne's forces strained under the pressure of the terrain, resistance, and logistical setbacks, the Continental Army prepared to confront them. The Saratoga campaign would soon unfold, proving to be a pivotal moment that reshaped the future of the Revolution. As the summer of 1777 wore on, and with every step southward, General Burgoyne's grand ambitions seemed to crumble beneath his army's feet. The lush farmlands of the Hudson Valley, at first a tempting prize, became a battlefield of attrition. Small American forts peppered the region, each requiring time and resources to capture. Worse, once taken, these forts had to be garrisoned, further depleting Burgoyne's numbers. What began as a campaign of confident marches soon slowed to a desperate crawl. The cracks in Burgoyne's armies widened with each passing week. Supplies dwindled rapidly, and what was once a steady force of 10,000 hardened soldiers began to splinter. The fertile farmland that his troops passed was both a blessing and a curse. Tempted by the promise of a better life, some soldiers deserted, choosing the plow over the musket. Others remained but felt the gnawing of hunger in their bellies as food supplies dwindled. Burgoyne's attempts to requisition provisions from the settlers fared no better. At first, these frontier farmers, hardy and indifferent to the grand politics of the Revolution, offered little resistance. Many hoped to avoid the war entirely, but neutrality became impossible as British soldiers began to take what was not freely given. For the farmers, this wasn't just about grain or livestock. It was about survival. What little they could grow was needed to sustain their family, and when the redcoats began confiscating food, outrage spread like wildfire. Some settlers retaliated in the only way they could, by burning their crops and destroying supplies rather than letting them fall into the British hands. The scorched earth defiance had an unintended effect. It drove the previously indifferent farmers straight into the arms of the revolutionaries. A swelling tide of angry settlers, armed with muskets and a righteous fury, joined the Continental Army. By the time Burgoyne's army staggered into the final stages of its campaign, his forces had shrunk to just 7,000. In contrast, the Continental Army, now bolstered by the local recruits, swelled to over 15,000 men. The first engagement of Saratoga came in September 1777. Burgoyne's professional soldiers, better trained and disciplined, managed a narrow victory against the Americans. But it was a ceremonial success, and the British had no time to savor it. The Second Battle of Saratoga in October was a different story entirely. At the heart of the American lines stood Benedict Arnold, a man whose fiery temperament had clashed with General Horatio Gates. Sidelined and seething with resentment, Arnold defied orders in a moment of sheer audacity. Charging headlong into the fray, he rallied the American forces with an energy born of anger and determination. Inspired by Arnold's reckless bravery, his men surged forward, overrunning the British positions. The battle descended into chaos, with Arnold at the heart of it. His horse was shot from underneath him, and as the beast fell, it crushed his leg. Arnold was carried from the battlefield injured, but victorious. Benedict Arnold, celebrated for his role in the victory of Saratoga, was hailed as a hero. His bravery and leadership seemed to secure his place among the great figures of the American Revolution. But his story would take a darker turn. Feeling underappreciated and frustrated by the lack of recognition, Arnold became resentful. Ultimately, he betrayed his country, conspiring to surrender the strategically important position at West Point to the British Army. The plot was foiled, and Arnold narrowly escaped to the British lines. From then on, the once celebrated patriot was branded a traitor. He spent the rest of his life in Britain, living in obscurity and carrying the stain of his betrayal to his grave. Today, the Saratoga battlefield honors Arnold, but not with the monument to the man himself. Instead, there stands the statue of his leg, which is a curious tribute that acknowledges his bravery at Saratoga without celebrating the traitor he became. By the time the smoke cleared, the British forces were spent. The loss of Saratoga was more than just a defeat. It was a collapse. Burgoyne, his army battered and out of options, attempted to retreat northward to Canada. But nature conspired against him. Torrential rains turned the landscape into quagmire, and once the proud British Army found itself trapped, starving, exhausted, and surrounded, General Burgoyne had no choice but to surrender. When the news of General Burgoyne's surrender reached the world, its impact was seismic. The capture of 6,000 British troops, the core of his force, marked one of the most significant victories of the war. It wasn't just the numbers, it was symbolism. This was a head-on clash with the British regulars, the finest soldiers of the empire, and the Americans had emerged victorious. The victory at Saratoga proved crucial, boosting the morale of the Continental Army and demonstrating to potential allies that the American cause was both just and winnable. Within months, France entered the war on the side of the Americans, bringing vital support. Meanwhile, the British, demoralized and forced to retreat, left the door wide open for the Continental Army to reclaim Philadelphia. This success was more than a strategic win. It symbolized the resilience and the growing strength of the young nation. Saratoga became a powerful emblem of America's determination to shape its own future. Ben Franklin's attire carried a sense of refined experience, symbolizing his years as a diplomat and statesman. His most significant role was far from the battlefield. In his early 60s, during events surrounding Saratoga, Benjamin Franklin was stationed in France, tirelessly working to secure a critical alliance. For months, he had urged the French court to support the American cause, facing resistance at every turn. The French, skeptical of the colonists' chances, were reluctant to risk a costly war with Britain for what seemed like a futile endeavor. But as news of Saratoga crossed the Atlantic, Franklin's persistent efforts to secure French support, which had seemed in vain for months, were finally about to pay off thanks to the monumental shift in perception caused by the American success at Saratoga. When the news of Saratoga reached France in late 1777, everything changed. Franklin seized the moment to present the victory as proof that the Americans could win. Eager to weaken their longtime rival and reclaim lost colonial territories, France decided to offer their support. In February of 1778, the United States and France signed the Treaty of Alliance, officially establishing France as an ally. This marked a turning point in the war, as the newly formed United States was no longer fighting alone. Soon after, Spain also joined the war against Britain, creating a powerful coalition. What had once been a desperate struggle for survival transformed into a coordinated international effort to defeat the British Empire. The American Revolution is turning the tide in what we could call a dramatic fashion, as France and Spain has entered the fray, transforming the fight for colonial independence into a global conflict. This isn't the end of the war, not yet, but it's a glaring shift. Imagine this scene. French ships darting through the Caribbean waters, clashing throughout with the British vessels. Spanish forces reclaiming Florida with a fiery determination. Battles erupting from the shores of Africa to the heart of Europe. The British, now stretched to their limits, scrambled to defend their empire, diverting troops back to Britain from the American colonies. In the colonies, the lull is almost eerie. By 1778, British forces settle into defensive positions in New York and Canada, regrouping and waiting. The revolutionaries, sensing an opportunity, push harder for direct military support. But France has grander ambitions. For them, this is a chance to cripple the Britain's global dominance. The Americans are left in limbo, questioning when their allies' focus will turn to their cause. Meanwhile, Spain seizes the moment. With memories of the 7 Years' War still fresh in their minds, they move swiftly to reclaim lost territories. By 1779, Spanish forces recapture Florida, contributing to the broader effort without fully endorsing the American cause. To Spain and France, This alliance is not about shared ideals, but about power. Land reclaimed and influence regained. The French Navy, however, proves to be the game changer. Cutting right through British supply lines, they weaken Britain's ability to sustain the war effort. Combined with Spain's victories, the balance of power shifts. Across the Atlantic, Britain feels the pressure. In London, King George III is raging. Historians later connect this mounting pressure to his deteriorating mental state. Under siege on multiple fronts, George III authorizes harsh measures to suppress the colonial armies. Naval bombardments hammer American coastal cities, especially in the South. Towns are reduced to rubble and property destroyed. Neutral civilians, like local businesses, watch as their livelihood shatters under cannon fire. To further destabilize the colonies, British forces arm Native American tribes, particularly in the Mississippi region, leading to raids that devastate American settlements. In a controversial move, the British offer freedom to enslaved people who join their cause. Thousands respond, escaping to British lines. Around 25,000 enslaved individuals ultimately fight for Britain. After the war, many find themselves resettled in Canada or the Caribbean, their fates a testament to promises kept and broken. By 1780, after years of chaos and destruction, most Southerners have turned against the crown. Still, the plan moves forward. General Charles Cornwallis leads the invasion, capturing Charleston in a decisive victory. The Continental Army stationed there is crushed. Reinforcements sent by George Washington also are defeated. By late 1780, the Continental Army in the South is nearly wiped out. For the revolutionaries, this is a dark hour. Help, however, comes from the unexpected living quarters. Disease. Malaria, yellow fever, and smallpox sweeps right through the British ranks. Southern militias, hardened by the years of struggle, rise to the challenge, harassing the British supply lines and disrupting their campaigns. Among them stands Nathaniel Greene, George Washington's trusted general. Greene's strategy is brilliant in its simplicity. Attack, retreat, repeat. Attack, retreat, repeat. And so he leads the British on this grueling chase, forcing them deeper into hostile territory and away from the supply lines. The toll on the British is huge. By 1781, Cornwallis's army is in tatters. It's disease-stricken and demoralized. Their retreat to Virginia sets the stage for the final act of the war. Cornwallis fortifies Yorktown and transforms it into a stronghold with fortifications bristling with cannons and soldiers. He hopes for reinforcements or at least an escape by sea, a last-ditch effort to salvage the British efforts in the war. But as usual, George Washington has other plans. With a meticulous strategy, Washington joins forces with the French, orchestrating a pincer movement that traps Cornwallis. The French Navy, commanded by Admiral de Grasse, blocks their escape route along the Chesapeake Bay, sealing off any hope of reinforcements or retreat. The combined Franco-American forces relentlessly bombard Yorktown, their artillery shattering British defenses day and night. Under siege, Cornwallis's position becomes untenable. His troops, low on supplies and morale, face unrelenting pressure from the colonial forces. After weeks of bombardment and failed attempts to break free, Cornwallis has no choice but to surrender. So on October 19, 1781, in a dramatic and humbling ceremony, the British troops march out of Yorktown to lay down their arms, marking a turning point in the war. The defeat at Yorktown in 1781 delivers a crushing blow for the Britain's ambitions in America. Though fighting drags on until 1783, Yorktown signals the beginning of the end. When the Treaty of Paris is signed, it formalizes Britain's defeat and the birth of a new nation. The treaty's terms are extraordinary. Britain cedes vast territories stretching to the Mississippi River. It's a colossal land grab for the fledgling United States, a bounty beyond the colonists' wildest dreams. For Britain, it's a humbling retreat. For the revolutionaries, it's vindication, a testament to the resilience, their alliances, and their belief in the promise of independence, thus ending the American Revolutionary War, a conflict born of rebellion but shaped by global forces. The ripples of the war stretches far beyond the 13 colonies, altering the balance of power and setting the stage for a new era in American history.
Now then, let there be freedom and independence.
In the dawn's early light, our flags were sown with might. From the hills we took our stand, in this untamed promised land. With the trumpets in our hearts,